At my son's $1 million wedding in Las Vegas, right there on a glamorous rooftop drowned in harsh neon lights, my daughter-in-law stared straight at my wife and said something that froze the entire place. She called her a humiliating name, and before anyone could react, she shoved the wedding cake straight onto the head of a woman who had just survived an accident, a woman who still needed a cane just to stay on her feet. My son stood there, silent. And in that moment, I realized this night was not just a wedding. If you're listening to this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. And now, so you can understand how a single wedding cake could bring down an entire family, I need to go back to the very first moment, the moment my wife slowly walked into that penthouse. I stood still for a few seconds after that moment, not because I didn't understand what had just happened, but because I needed to be sure I'd heard it right. On the rooftop of the Grand Zenith, the night wind brushed across the infinity pool. The lights of the Strip flickered in the distance, like a perfect backdrop for a show that didn't belong there. The wedding had been flowing smoothly until everything slipped off course in just a few breaths. My wife, Olivia, was struggling to stay upright. Her legs were still weak after the accident, so every step had to be calculated. She didn't want attention. I knew that. She wore low shoes, held tightly to the cane I gave her years ago, a quiet reminder that we'd made it through enough together. She moved slowly, very slowly, trying not to disturb anyone. But in a place like that, even the smallest misstep draws every eye. The cane caught the edge of a tablecloth. There was no loud noise, just a soft slide. Olivia lost her balance and tipped forward. By the time I took a step toward her, it was already over. Brooklyn's shimmering wedding dress was stained. Not badly, just a small mark, something that could have been fixed in minutes. But the silence that fell over the penthouse was so heavy, I could hear the background music falter. Brooklyn turned around. There was no confusion in her eyes, no instinct to help, just irritation hidden beneath flawless makeup. She didn't look at Olivia like someone who had fallen. She looked at her like someone who had offended her. I saw her lips tighten, then part. She made a cruel remark about my wife's appearance and her clumsiness. People around us held their breath. No one spoke. No one stepped in. The 3-tier wedding cake was set nearby. I remember it clearly, because I had approved every detail. Brooklyn reached for the largest piece. For a brief second, I hoped she would stop at words, but she didn't. She pressed the cake straight into Olivia's face. No rush, no hesitation. One firm motion, like it had been practiced. Olivia didn't scream. She just stood there frozen. White frosting slid down her hair, already touched with gray. I saw her hands trembling. Not from pain, but from humiliation. In that moment, I didn't think about the guests. I didn't think about reputation. I only saw the woman who had stood beside me for over 40 years, being treated like an obstacle at someone else's celebration. I waited for Jackson. I waited for my son to step forward. One sentence would have been enough. One gesture of protection. But he did nothing. Jackson stood a few meters away, a glass in his hand. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at the faces watching, as if weighing which reaction would benefit him most. Then he said it, loud enough for me to hear, that his mother had embarrassed him. That this was a place for people with status, not a place to bring old problems. He didn't shout. There was no anger in his voice. And yet, those words landed heavier than any sound. That's when I understood. In my son's mind, his mother had become a burden, something to be avoided. The music came back on, like an attempt to patch the moment. A few forced laughs. Some phones lowered, then quietly lifted again. I walked to Olivia. I didn't speak. I simply placed my hand on her shoulder and guided her away from the center of the party. No one stopped us. No one asked if she was all right. They pretended it was just a minor incident in a luxurious night. We went into a small room inside. I helped Olivia wash her face, wiped away the remaining frosting. She didn't cry. That worried me more. She only whispered that she was sorry for ruining the wedding dress. I didn't answer right away. I needed time to steady my voice. Then I told her she had done nothing wrong, that no important day ever gives someone permission to forget basic respect. When I closed the door, the music outside kept playing. The wedding went on. as if nothing had happened. I stood there under soft lighting, looking at my wife's exhausted face, and I knew this night wasn't over. Not the way they thought, and not the way I had imagined, when I agreed to host this celebration. I left the lounge once Olivia was seated, her breathing more even. She told me not to make a big deal out of it. Her voice was very soft. She said maybe she should go home early. I nodded, but I didn't promise anything. Some things, once you've seen them, you can't pretend they never happened. Out in the hallway, leading to the VIP area, the lighting was gentler. The music was muffled behind thick doors. I walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but because I needed to hear clearly. In places like this, people tell the truth most honestly, when they think no one is listening. The VIP room door was slightly open. I stopped standing behind a heavy curtain. Brooklyn's voice came first, not loud, not sharp, cold, precise. She talked about the dress, about the embarrassment, about how a small accident had nearly ruined the image she had worked so hard to build. Then she shifted, quicker now, more decisive. Money. I heard the name Sterling, Brooklyn's father. I knew that man. In Vegas, you don't need many meetings to know who stands where. Sterling had shown up more than once on lists of people in financial trouble. Not rumors. Numbers. Numbers I had seen long ago, even if I'd never mentioned them to my son. Brooklyn said her family couldn't afford another slip. That this wedding wasn't just a ceremony. It was a way out. That after tonight, everything had to move in the right direction. Jackson answered, in a calming tone. Promises. Reassurance. He said everything was arranged. That all they needed was patience. I heard a soft sound, like a slap on the shoulder. Not loud, but final. Brooklyn said she didn't want to wait, that she'd waited long enough. That having to show respect to her mother-in-law was the most unbearable part of being in that room full of luxury. Those words didn't need to be raised. They found their way to me, clear, undeniable. Jackson didn't object. That chilled me more than anything, she said. He only said it would all be over soon, that Olivia wouldn't be appearing in places like this anymore, that there were ways to speed things up. He didn't give details. He just mentioned small changes, decisions made for the long-term benefit. I heard enough. I didn't need to hear more. I stepped back, not out of fear of being discovered, but because I needed to steady myself. In that moment, I didn't feel anger rise. I felt emptiness, a hollow feeling, realizing where the son I raised had chosen to stand. I went back to the lounge. Olivia looked up when she saw me. She asked if I was all right. I said I was. I lied, calmly. I told her maybe we should stay a little longer, let the party settle down. She looked at me as if she wanted to ask more, then nodded. She has always trusted me that way. I sat beside her, my hand resting on the familiar cane. In my mind, the pieces began to fit together. The rushed calls before the wedding, the temporary transfer requests, the vague promises about Jackson's future. I had seen them all, and I chose silence, because I believed a family needs space to stand on its own. Tonight I understood that silence had been mistaken for permission. Outside I heard glasses clinking. Someone was making a toast. I knew Sterling was at the center of those handshakes. I knew he was smiling, believing everything was settled. In Vegas, people are used to betting on appearances. Few bother to check the underside of the card. I stood up. I told Olivia I needed to step out for a moment. She took my hand, very lightly. She didn't ask questions. That trust made my steps heavier and firmer. When I stepped onto the balcony, the night wind was stronger. The strip glowed below, a reminder that this city never sleeps and never forgets. I looked down at the stream of cars and thought about the decisions that had brought me here, about what I had built over decades, and how it was being treated like a tool. I turned back inside. The music was still playing. People were still laughing. No one knew that in a room just moments ago words had been spoken that shattered the last thing holding this family together. I wasn't in a hurry. I knew that. When the truth comes into the light, it needs to be placed carefully. And I also knew that from that moment on, this party was no longer just a wedding. I didn't go back to the lounge right away. I stood at the edge of the party, where the light wasn't too harsh and not too dim either. From there I could see almost everything, without being seen myself. Years in business taught me one thing early on. Before you speak, Make sure you're holding the full picture. Sterling was in the middle of a crowd, laughing loudly, raising his glass, talking about connections, about the future of two families coming together. People around him nodded, pleased. I caught fragments of congratulations about a promising merger. The way they said it told me everything. Sterling had been telling a story very different from the truth. I didn't step in. I simply signaled to a technical coordinator. He looked at me and gave a small nod. No words needed. Everything had been prepared in advance, even if no one at the party knew it. When you host an event in a place you control, you always leave yourself a few options. The music began to lower, not abruptly, slowly, like someone gently turning a dial. Conversations faded. Sterling was still talking, but he started to realize he was no longer the only center of attention. I stepped forward, not in a rush. I adjusted my sleeve, stood straight. A few people recognized me. Some whispered. Some went quiet. Jackson saw me from across the room. His eyes flickered for a moment. Then he pulled himself together. Brooklyn stood beside him, her smile still fixed in place. I asked for the music to be turned off completely. This time, no one objected. Silence spread across the penthouse. I said I needed to interrupt the party for a few minutes. My voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. At my age, I've learned this. Certainty doesn't come from volume. I began with a simple question. How many people here truly understood the financial relationship between the two families? No one answered. Sterling let out a tight laugh. He said this was a celebration, not the time for complicated matters. I nodded as if I agreed. Then I gave a signal. The large screen behind the stage lit up. Not wedding photos, not a highlight video. Numbers, plain, undecorated, loans, timelines, commitments left unmet. Sterling's name appeared again and again. No long explanation was needed. Anyone familiar with business understood immediately what they were looking at. Sterling turned toward me. His smile was gone. He said it was a misunderstanding, that everything could be sorted out later. I said I agreed, but not after tonight. I said this celebration was built on trust, and that trust had just been tested. I turned to Jackson and Brooklyn. I said I had heard enough to understand what they expected after this wedding. I didn't repeat their words. I didn't need to. I only said I was disappointed that they had treated what we built as something that could simply be passed along. Brooklyn tried to speak. I raised my hand, not to silence her, but to ask for one more minute. I said there was one thing everyone needed to understand: the assets they were standing in, the services they were enjoying. None of it appeared by chance. It was built with time, with discipline, and by never placing blind bets on anyone, not even family. I signaled again. A short audio recording played. Brief, unedited. Just a conversation Jackson believed would never be heard. I didn't look at him while it played. I looked at Olivia. She was standing at the edge of the room, her hand gripping the cane. She wasn't crying. She stood straight, as if reclaiming something that had been taken far too easily. When the recording ended, no one spoke. The air felt thick. Sterling sat down in a nearby chair. Brooklyn went pale. Jackson looked at me, and for the first time that night, he didn't hide his confusion. I said this wasn't an exposure meant to humiliate anyone. I said this was the truth, and the truth has a habit of showing up when no one expects it. I said that from this moment on, any unspoken arrangements were void. Everything would be reviewed again, transparently according to what had been signed from the beginning. I didn't talk about punishment. I didn't talk about taking anything away right now. I only said that decision-making power had returned to where it belonged. And that sometimes the most painful realization isn't loss. It's understanding that you never truly held something in the first place. I ended with one short sentence, that the party could continue, but no longer under the script a few people had written. I stepped back and left the stage to silence. In that moment, I knew the balance had shifted. No pushing, no shouting, just placing everything under a clear enough light and letting each person face their own part. The silence that followed didn't last long, but it lasted long enough for everyone to understand there was nothing left to hide. I didn't leave the stage right away. I stayed there for a few more breaths, not to savor the moment, but to make sure what had just been revealed had time to settle into everyone in the room. I gave another signal, this time not to the screen or the sound system, but to the hotel's security management team. They didn't storm in. They simply took fixed positions quietly, just enough to remind everyone that this space was now under control. I didn't want the night to turn into chaos. I just wanted to close the doors that had been opened in the wrong way. I turned to Brooklyn. I didn't repeat what she had said to Olivia. There was no need. I only said that the wedding dress she was wearing, and most of the glittering things around her, had been paid for through an account in my wife's name. I spoke slowly, so there could be no misunderstanding, and that using those things came with one basic condition: respect. Brooklyn stood still. She looked down at her dress, then looked around, searching for support. But the eyes that had been eager before now looked away. Sterling moved as if to step forward. I looked at him. Just for a second. He stopped. In Vegas, you learn when to move and when to stay still. I said that Brooklyn and her family should leave the party earlier than planned, not as a punishment, but as a necessary ending to a role that had gone too far. I asked the staff to escort them out discreetly. Quietly. I didn't want any more images that could be misunderstood. Brooklyn reacted late. She said this was her day. I nodded. I said yes. And that was exactly why the day shouldn't end the way it had begun. She went silent. Sterling lowered his head, for the first time that night, as if he finally realized every path had been closed. When they left, the penthouse felt emptier, not because there were fewer people, but because a layer of illusion had been stripped away. I turned to Jackson. He stood there without a drink in his hand, his shoulders slightly slumped. I called his name, just once. He stepped forward. I handed Jackson a thin stack of papers. Not thick, but heavy enough. I told him it was a summary of the financial guarantees I had backed over the years. I didn't scold him. I only said that starting today those guarantees would be closed. Not out of anger, but out of responsibility. That a man cannot stand on his own if he keeps leaning on something he's never learned to protect. Jackson looked at me, his lips moving. He said he never meant to hurt his mother. I listened. I've always listened to him, even now. I told him intention doesn't erase consequences, and that the most painful thing tonight wasn't the words spoken, but his silence when he should have spoken up. I told him to leave the party with what he brought into it, his name and the responsibility that comes with it. There was no loud expulsion, no harsh declaration, just a door opened, and a path he now had to walk on his own. Jackson walked slowly. Before he disappeared from my sight, he turned back. That look wasn't defiance anymore. It was the confusion of someone who had just lost the shelter he didn't even realize he depended on so deeply. When things finally settled, I went to find Olivia. She was standing near the balcony looking out. The strip lights reflected in her eyes, but they didn't blind her. I walked over and placed my hand on her shoulder. She didn't ask what I had done. She only said she was tired. I nodded. I told her we could leave whenever she wanted. The party continued, but in a different way. No more exaggerated congratulations. No more rushed handshakes. Just small, cautious conversations. I knew that from that moment on, people would remember this night not for its luxury, but for the silence that reshaped it. Olivia and I left the penthouse before the night grew too late. When the elevator doors closed, I let out my first breath since everything began. Not out of relief, but because I knew I had done what needed to be done. Not to retaliate, not to make an example, but to close a cycle, one that had gone on far too long. The elevator moved down slowly. I stood beside Olivia. Her hand rested on the rail, the cane leaning gently against her leg. No one spoke. This silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like a necessary pause, after a long stretch of road. When the doors opened in the lobby below, I felt as if I had stepped out of a different world. A place where everything had been exaggerated by lights and misplaced expectations. We didn't go home right away. I brought Olivia back up to the penthouse after most of the party had cleared out. Not to face anyone again, but to gather what had been left unfinished. Olivia said she wanted to see the place one more time. Not as a guest, but as someone who had walked through it and was still standing. The penthouse was much quieter now. Staff moved about, silently cleaning. The traces of the party slowly disappeared. I took Olivia out to the balcony. The night air was cooler, carrying the familiar scent of this city. She looked down at the strip. People kept moving below, unaware that a story had just ended far above them. Olivia said she wasn't sad anymore. She said it naturally, like a truth she had just discovered. She told me that when the cake was pushed onto her head, what hurt most wasn't the humiliation. It was the moment she felt invisible. But when I stepped forward, when I stood beside her, she realized she had never truly been abandoned. With the tip of her cane, she gently brushed a small piece of leftover cake from the table beside the chair. Not in anger, just clearing away something that no longer belonged to her. Then she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was steady. She said this penthouse shouldn't only be a place for lavish parties. She wanted to turn it into something else. A quiet space, where people who needed care could come without asking permission, without explaining themselves. I listened. I always listen to Olivia, even when I don't speak. The idea didn't surprise me. For years, she has seen value where others only see profit. I told her that if that's what she wanted, we would do it. No grand announcements, no large nameplates, just the right people doing the right work. A few weeks later, the penthouse began to change. The infinity pool was still there, but no longer a backdrop for loud parties. Large rooms were divided. The lighting softened. Olivia took part in every small decision. She spoke to the people who came here with rare patience. I stood back and watched, and understood that real power doesn't come from giving orders. It comes from creating space for others to be themselves. Jackson did call me. Not many times, just once. He said he was trying to manage on his own. I didn't ask for details. I told him I hoped he would learn how to stand on his own feet. The call ended quickly. No grand reconciliation, but no door slammed shut either. As for Brooklyn and her family, I heard nothing more worth noting. In Vegas, things come and go quickly. I didn't look further. Some stories are meant to be left alone once they reach their natural end. One afternoon, Olivia and I sat on the penthouse balcony. The sun was setting, its light stretching across the buildings, softening the city's sharp edges. Olivia placed her hand on mine. She said she felt relieved, not because she had won against anyone, but because she no longer had to try to please people who refused to see her. I thought about that wedding night, about everything that happened. I realized the greatest mistake my son and that family made wasn't greed. It was confusing kindness with weakness. They believed silence would stay silent forever. They forgot that sometimes silence is just the way a person waits for the right moment to speak. In Vegas, people love to bet on what shines. But the brightest thing isn't always the strongest. I learned that long ago, and I hope one way or another, everyone involved learned their own lesson too. When the sun fully disappeared, Olivia and I were still there, not saying much, just holding hands, the way we have for all these years. That is the ending I chose. No noise, no display, just two people who made it through a storm and still had the calm to look ahead. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it, so honest, reflective family stories like this can reach more people. The message I want to leave is simple. Kindness is not weakness, but when goodwill is taken for granted, knowing when to stay silent and when to speak is the only way to protect dignity and fairness. Family is not a place to fight for power. It is where we learn how to respect one another. Thank you for being here. Until the end of this story.